Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everyone to this talk with Dr. Aisha Musa. Dr. Aisha holds a PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University. Dr. Aisha's research and teaching interests include Hadith and Sunnah, translation of classical Arabic texts, Quranic interpretation, women's issues, Islamic law, and modern-day reformist and neo-traditionalist movements. We are so happy that you made the time to talk to us. Welcome, Dr. Aisha.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. It's good to be here.
If you could enlighten us, because I didn't come from a scholar background, and I think most people don't. Could you tell us, what does research in Islamic studies and Quranic interpretation involve?
Well, for me, it involves a lot of deep study of the text. Islam is a very text-based religion. It's the religion of, the book. The Quran is the book. And Hadith were originally oral, but now are in book form. And even oral information is in some way text, documentary text. And so I spend a lot of time with text and studying language. I began studying Arabic when I converted to Islam in about 1979. One of the things I really wanted to do was to read the Quran in the original language. And I'm a very academically minded person. I grew up, my grandparents were both teachers. We had books around us all of my youth growing up. So it just was a natural thing for me to study. I did originally a bachelor's in international studies, specializing in the Middle East, because that was the closest I could get to Islamic studies when I started. I did a master's in teaching with a focus on Arabic and applied linguistics, and then eventually the doctorate. So for me, it's just been years of study, and I spend a lot of time with text. The books you see behind me is, my personal Islamic studies library. So it's a lot of really deep analysis of text for me.
Some people, they have cultural norms, and then they read the Quran to justify the cultural norms. Now, being a convert, you didn't have that kind of...
Exactly. I had never heard of Islam. Islam was not a household word when I was growing up. I grew up Catholic, and back then you didn't study other religions. So I had literally never heard of Islam before I read a translation of the Quran. And another teenage girl gave me a copy of the Quran because she was reading it. I don't even know why she was reading it. I don't know if she was taking a college class in Middle East studies or maybe dating a Muslim. I don't know. I don't know why she was reading it, but she gave me a copy of a translation of the Quran. And what struck me was the individual relationship with God, because as a child, and I don't mean to insult anyone who's Catholic, but as a child, I felt like God was lost somewhere behind Jesus and Mary and Joseph and all the saints. And so I was really interested. I didn't have the words to say it at the time because I was just a kid, but I was really looking for tawheed, right? A real direct relationship with God. But so I came to the Quran and I saw that, but I had no idea about Islam. I had heard the name Mohammed, but I just kind of had some image in my mind of somebody like Gandhi, bald hair and a loincloth. I had no idea. But I was very attracted to the Quran, and I started studying Arabic, and after that was when I started to meet Muslims. But I did not come to the Quran with any preconceived ideas about what Islam is or what the Quran teaches.
Right. Okay, so if you pick just any Muslim and ask them about LGBTQ person or people, they're most likely to say being gay is haram. And they're most likely not able to tell you why exactly. Some will give you their personal opinion, and some will quote the story of Lot. And queer Muslim activists have been saying the story of Lot is not about homosexuality or same-sex attraction. It's about rape and using sex as a tool for subjugation. You have a YouTube video where you discuss this topic, and you frame this by saying both conventional rules and ethics are derived from the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah. Can you explain why which is divine and which is derived?
Well, from my perspective as a Muslim and an academic, the Quran is the divine revelation, because the Quran is the words of God, contains the words of God that God revealed to Muhammad through the agency of the angel Gabriel. And that's the text that we have inherited in Arabic. Many Muslims believe the Hadith also contain divine inspiration, wahi, but this is controversial among early Muslims, and even the Prophet himself said, there's a Hadith where he said, when I tell you something related to the religion, then you should believe me, but I don't. It was about date palm trees, and he gave somebody advice, and they took it, and the date crop failed, and he said, I'm not the farmer. It's not about the religion. So, for me, the divine revelation is the Quran, the words of the Quran. The Prophet was inspired, but we know from the Quran that the Prophet also made mistakes and God corrected him. So the Hadith literature that's passed on is stories other people told about what the Prophet said and did. So for me, that has a much lower status. And then what's human are the rules that are derived. Text is there, and people interact with it. So when people read the text, they will read it, as you said, from their own cultural perspective. And even the word fiqh, which means legal rulings, in Islamic technical terminology, the literal meaning is understanding. And the reason that the word understanding is what becomes legal rules is because jurists use their intellect, and they read the text, and they looked at the situation around them, and they came to an understanding. So the rules that we derive from the scripture are human derived rules. So there's always a human interaction with the text. The text itself, the text of the Quran, is what contains the divine word.
Okay, so the story of Prophet Lot, that's the divine word. But the interpretation of that's human.
Yes, what people do with that is human. And you talked about the way that LGBTQ activists read the text versus the way other people may read it. And what LGBTQ activists say is actually a more literal and holistic reading of the text than the people who are looking at the story of Lot and thinking it's about same-sex attraction are focusing on just a few words in the verses and a particular interpretation of a few words about you approach men lustfully, right? But they're not looking at the entire story, which is told in the Quran, which says all of the men of the city came rushing. And then the Hadith that I cited in the video you mentioned add further details of the way early Muslims understood that story. And that is there's nothing in the story that looks like the people of Lot were looking for what I understand gay and lesbian Muslims to be looking for, which is committed, contractually entered, publicly recognized same-sex relationships. All of the men of the city, according to the Quran, came rushing, right? And then the Hadith, as I cited, the story of Lot's wife in the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba, and the men came and were trying to beat down the door. this is not people coming to Lot and telling him, we love each other, or we want to enter, a marriage contract of some kind. It's a very different view. The wording, when you look at the wording that the Quran uses and that the Hadith use, and the description of what's going on, there's not. It just doesn't sound like what gay and lesbian Muslims are looking for. They're not looking for that kind of, we're going to go get these people. Because really, even the Arabic terminology is kind of predator-prey relationship. As I think I point that out in the video. The Arabic word that's used in one of the Hadith, that's glossing the Quranic story of Lot, says that, no, men didn't jump other men until the people of Lot, because Lot says to his people, you're doing something nobody did before. And the early Hadith collectors who are discussing what that story meant use a word that means a predator jumping on prey. So these are very violent descriptions. There's nothing loving, there's nothing even if you think of a marriage contract as, money and economics, which is one of the ways that marriage is looked at in traditional societies, even not Islamic societies, where families married their children together for money or, political alliances, whatever reasons. None of that seems to apply to the people of Lot as it's described in the Quran or in the Hadith.
Yes, because if you look at another verse where you form relationships for mercy and comfort, and that doesn't describe that.
Right, that does not describe. The Quran is not describing that in the story of the people of Lot. But a lot of Muslims don't really read the Quran closely. And this is not just Muslims. Christians, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, a lot of people do not come to their religion and say, let me see what the text says. They go to their local mosque or their local temple or their local church, and they learn it from their family. They learn the religion at home and in their local community. And Islam is a very text-based religion. And that's really where I focus, is what do the texts say? And I always try to approach the text with the possibility that my understanding of something could be wrong. What is the text going to show me that I need to learn? And follow what the textual evidence actually says.
That people like to use precedents, like they'll say, the four school of thoughts or Ijma. Can you elaborate more on how those four school of thoughts came into being and how Ijma factor into that and into what we have today?
Well, the four schools of thought as we know them today are actually what made it this far. Because if you go back 1,000 or 1,200 years in Islamic history, there were literally dozens of schools of thought. And the schools of thought are each named for the four individuals whose ideas became popular among Muslims and their students passed them on. So the Hanafi school is named for Abu Hanifa. His students were following his teachings and his ideas. He died in about 150 after the Hijrah. 150, when Muhammad died 10 years after the Hijrah. So Abu Hanifa died about 140 years after Muhammad. The Shafi'i school is named for Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, who died about 50 years after Abu Hanifa, and he was also a scholar who gave legal opinions, and his students after him continued passing on those opinions. Malik is earlier than Shafi'i, but after Abu Hanifa. He wrote one of the earliest books of fiqh, And then the last of them is the Hanbali school, named for Ahmed ibn Hanbal. Because what happened was scholars would give their opinions. They would study these things. People would ask them questions. Because what Muslims have always wanted to know is how to be a good Muslim. What do I need to do? Because Islam is a very action-oriented religion. We're supposed to act in this world. So what does it mean to be a good Muslim? And the ideas that were the most popular with Muslims were the ones that the students carried on and came to be named for those individuals. In my opinion, I don't think any of those individuals intended to found schools of thought, but their ideas were considered so important and so popular that they've carried on to this day. And scholars in each of those schools continue to render opinions that are informed by the early work, but the schools evolved over time. But 1,000 or 1,200 years ago, as I said, there were literally dozens of schools. And we've ended up with 4 Sunni schools. And I don't know a lot about Shi'i Islam, so, but I think there's a couple of Shi'i schools. So it really is much narrower than it was in the formative period. What was the other part of your question? There was another part of your question.
How does Ijma play a role?
Ijma is a word that means consensus, and the Sunni schools have agreed that there are 4 sources of law. There's the Quran, there's the Sunnah, there's analogical reasoning, which is called qiyas, and then there's Ijma, which is the consensus of scholars. And the very idea of consensus was also very controversial 1,200 years ago. In fact, Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, for whom the Shafi'i school is named, was not in favor of the idea of consensus, because he said, consensus of how many scholars? If there are 10 scholars in a region, and, one of them isn't at the meeting, do the other 9 count as consensus? He had all kinds of challenging questions for the idea of consensus. Nevertheless, Muslims came over the centuries to accept it, and it really means like the scholars get together, they have a general agreement on something, and so people then say, okay, the scholars agree on this, so this is the law. Ijma is very, very much the human element in, you were asking about the human versus the divine. Ijma is very human. It is the human interaction. It's a consensus of human opinions. Yes, they were arrived at. You don't have to say they were, that they're impious or they're doing anything wrong, but it is human opinion.
So after all the questions we've had before, is the Quran homophobic, or is homophobia derived?
I think homophobia is derived. I don't see anything in the Quran that is homophobic. I think we really need to also begin to question, what our own ideas are about homosexuality, and where those ideas come from. But I think homophobia is definitely a human emotion. I see nothing in the Quran that even talks about homosexuality as we understand it today. That is, people who are exclusively attracted to people of their own sex. Because again, that's not what we see with the people of Lot in the story as the Quran tells it. So I don't see anything in the Quran that addresses it. And certainly not in a negative way. Because what the people of Lot were doing doesn't seem to fit what we know as same-sex attraction today. It just doesn't. So I don't see the Quran as homophobic, no.
And the other portion is the Sunnah or Hadith. Were there any records of Prophet Muhammad ostracizing or mistreating or shunning people who identify as same-sex attracted?
No, there is nothing in the Sahih Hadith collections. Of the Sunni canon, the two Sahihs are the most elevated. There is nothing about homosexuals in them. There's nothing about qawm in the two Sahihs. There are qawm hadith, which I discussed in my YouTube video, that are in other collections, but they are not Sahih. And I know of no scholars prior to the 20th century who deemed any of them to be Sahih. So we don't know that the Prophet even addressed the Qawm Lut, the people of Lot, from the Sahih collections. And there is no record of the Prophet ever having punished anybody for whatever the activity of the people of Lot was, and there's no indication that he punished anyone for any kind of same-sex activity that we know of.
What would you then say to queer Muslims who suffer from religious trauma because of the misuse of the stories of Prophet Lot?
I would encourage them to actually read the story closely to see what it is talking about, because if they do that, they will see that the activists who are telling them it's not about same-sex attraction are actually much closer to what the text actually says, because there's nothing in the text to indicate that it is about same-sex attraction in the sense that we're talking about it today. Yes, the people of Lot were approaching men lustfully. It was men approaching men lustfully, but it's in a very violent and aggressive context, which is not what I understand gay and lesbian Muslims to be looking for in their relationships. So they should take comfort in the fact that a close and holistic reading the whole story, not just taking the verse that said, or the words, you approach men lustfully, without the whole story, that because I'm a text-based person, I would find comfort in that. I am not gay myself. I'm an ally. I'm a very strong ally. But I take comfort in the fact that the text doesn't say what a lot of people think it says. And then the other thing, and any Muslim should take comfort in this, as Dr. Wadood said one time, when you say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim and you really think about what Rahman and Rahim mean, how can you feel anything but love, right? God is, the Rahman, the Rahim. And that should be comforting to all Muslims, that those are the attributes that God most often uses to describe him or her or itself, because God is genderless, in the Quran. Rahman and Rahim are the most frequently used names of God in the Quran. And that, to me, is tremendous comfort. Because, as I said, as Dr. Wadood pointed out, how can you feel anything but love when you approach God, knowing that is how God describes God, right?
There's also a verse, I think, that you mentioned in your video, that you said about we only sent you as a mercy to mankind.
Right.
What was
this is the verse in Surah Al-Anbiya, the 21st surah of the Quran, 107. And some people may say it's referring to the Quran. Most Muslims believe it's referring to Muhammad. God speaking to Muhammad says, we only sent you as a mercy to the world, as rahmah lil alameen. And for me, that becomes the overarching principle from which we have to interpret the Sunnah. Because if somebody comes to us with a story about the Prophet that is counter to that idea of being a mercy to humanity, we need to question it, because the Quran tells us the Prophet was an honorable messenger and that he did what God commanded him to do. So, and when God says to him, we only sent you as a mercy to the world, that's a very powerful statement. Because Rahma, and Rahma again is one of those words like Rahman and Rahim. That is the overarching principle, right? And so anytime we interpret the text, that should be our approach. And anytime we interpret the Sunnah, that should be our approach, in my opinion.
Are there any new works that we can look forward to?
Well, I am working on a video now as a follow-up to the video that's already on YouTube, because when Dr. Wadud asked me, are any of these reports that you're talking about, I decided I would start looking into it, and so I'm actually doing a video now that's tentatively entitled Vetting a Qawm Lut Hadith, because I'm going to look at how this is used on a contemporary Hadith website and how it shows the issues related to deciding how much authority to give a particular Hadith and some of the challenges. And so I'm going to try and break it down kind of simply to show people what Hadith scholars were doing in relation to particular Hadith. And, you know, what's a Sahih Hadith versus a Hasan Hadith versus a Da'if, right? So that, because, as you said, a lot of people don't know what goes into this. They just, you know, find a Hadith on a website, and because it's, you know, one of the collections that they recognize the name of, or it's on a website that is, you know, put out by a Muslim organization, they take it and they use it, and maybe they don't know how to use it, or maybe they don't realize that, you know, yeah, it's in the collection, but scholars would never use it to make law, for example, because there are critiques of Hadith that they make. So I'm working on that most recently, on looking specifically at a particular Qawm Lut Hadith. I also have a book chapter on marriage, sexuality, and the people of Lot. Professor Omid Safi and Scott Kugel are editing a volume on sex and sexuality and Islamic thought, and that's in the pipeline somewhere. I'm not sure what the status is, but I sent my revised chapter back in January, so that'll be coming out. But I am going to be doing some more videos specifically on these topics to try and break it down like I would for an undergraduate classroom, for example, right? Because it can be, I understand it can be very confusing. Yeah. So I want to try and break it down so that people can have some confidence in approaching the text.
Right. And these resources are found on your website?
Yes, yeah. And I will put these, I have a YouTube channel. You can find them there. On my website, the resources on my website are my published works, and I also have a resource link that will take you to Hadith collections, to Arabic dictionaries, to Quran websites. But one of the things I want to do in some of my YouTube videos is show people how to use those resources. And I also have, for example, on my YouTube channel, something about the life of Muhammad and finding and accessing sources. Because so much is available so easily on the internet, it's easy to get lost, it's easy to not know whether something is legit or whether something is problematic, or how to go about it. And I really see a need for that, so I'm going to try and do just little short YouTube videos that will help people in approaching the sources. And again, I'm going to break it down like I would if we were in my undergraduate university classroom. So I'm going to assume that the audience wants to know, but doesn't necessarily know how to figure it out. Yeah. Not treating people like they're stupid, but trying to hold their hand and make it a little bit easier.
Right. We will put a link to your YouTube at the end of this video. So thank you so much for your time today. And this concludes our conversation, and hopefully we get to chat to you again.
Inshallah.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
You're welcome. Wa alaikum assalam.